Without further ado, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. First, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You could be anywhere on this Tuesday evening, but on a slightly warmer winter night here in Chicago, you're here talking about tax increment financing in Chicago Public Schools. And so I'm Hal Woods. I'm the Chief of Policy here at Kids for Chicago. We are really glad that you're here tonight to be a part of this conversation. We're very grateful to our co-hosts for this webinar. We've got two terrific partners, the Civic Federation, who is with us now, as well as with the Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community, CBCAC, and their expertise and their leadership are really going to make this conversation stronger and more accessible as well. We're also very grateful to Alderwoman Nicole Lee and to Civic Federation President Joe Ferguson, who are willing to share their perspectives, as well as Nell Salzman from the New York Times for moderating tonight's discussion. So this is a topic that we know means a lot to families across the city. We appreciate you taking the time to be a part of it. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Clayton from the Coalition for Better Chinese American Community to introduce himself and to also to share their partnership in the program. So Clayton, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. This is Clayton Shu from Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community. I'm policy manager at this organization, and we are a civic engagement and civic education organization based in Chicago, Chinatown. We serve the Chinese Americans around this area, and we also have other community development projects as well. We support small business and other immigrants' rights. And yeah, that's and then I will be responsible for taking the Chinese questions, and also I'll be sending a link to the Chinese slide. So let me do it again with in Chinese. 大家好我叫Clayton，然后我是华不更好团结联盟的政策经理。今晚很欢迎大家来到这样的一个关于 TIF 和我们 CPS 的一个会议。那我们今晚呢，我们会讲到这些内容呢，我会把一个中文的资料都放在这个聊天，就是 chat 下面，大家可以点开 chat 那里，然后待会我把这个把内容放到那边，大家可以自己去查看。然后有什么内容的，有什么问题呢？你们可以在 chat 里面用中文输入，然后我会来帮大家解答。Okay, that's my introduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clayton. And just before we get started in earnest, we're going to share in the chat if folks can see it. Oops, sorry. We're going to share in the chat. We do have this presentation sent out by email to folks, but we have this available in English, in Spanish, and also in Chinese Mandarin. And so this is I think this is our second trilingual program. So the English presentation will be what you see on the screen. So we want to give folks a chance, and I emailed out earlier today, but if folks have a chance they can pull up either the Spanish language or the Chinese Mandarin translation of the presentation, and they can kind of have it along with them, and then also log into the interpretation channel and be able to hear everything in their preferred language. So we'll give folks just a moment for that. Right. So this is how we're going to spend our time together tonight. We're going to start with a brief welcome and a quick framing of why this conversation matters right now. This will be especially specific to Chicago Public Schools families across the city. We are going to then move into an introduction of tax increment financing. This is not meant to be overly technical. The goal is to give everyone a shared understanding and a foundation so the rest of the conversation really makes sense. After that, we will shift to a panel discussion with Alderwoman Nicole Lee, with Joe Ferguson from the Civic Federation that will be moderated by Nell Salzman of the New York Times. And this is where we're really going to be talking about TIF decisions, how the TIF decisions actually get made, and what they mean in practice. We'll also have time for questions along the way. I think the chat has been enabled so everyone can see the questions. Thank you for the links to the chat. And we're looking forward to tonight's conversation. So just a little bit of quick framing before we dive into the details, and we're really going to start out with kind of like a TIF 101 conversation. We want to pause just for a moment to to talk about why this conversation is so important. So I want to start by naming something. Tax increment financing, which really is the subject of tonight's conversation. It is the one of the most debated and also one of the least understood parts of how Chicago funds economic development projects in our city. But it's also a way that we fund public services, including Chicago Public Schools. And so over the last several years, TIF has moved to becoming um, really right at the center around CPS budget fights. We've seen that over the last 12 to 18 months. So decisions about TIF have helped shape how CPS balances its budget, how much money schools receive, and how conflicts and these conflicts have kind of played out between CPS leadership, the CPS board, the mayor's office, and city council. And so disagreements about TIF and the related budget assumptions have contributed to some instability in the district. We've seen board tensions, we've seen even leadership turnover, and a lot of uncertainty for schools and families. So when we talk about TIF tonight, please know that these decisions they have had and they will continue to have direct consequences on Chicago public schools. Now, for CPS, TIF can show up in different ways. First, TIF funds can be used for capital projects, things like building renovations, roof repairs, heating systems, new school playgrounds or annexes, and other school improvements. These are often one-time investments, but they're important for safe, functional school buildings. We also know that there's TIF surplus. We're going to spend most of our time tonight talking about TIF surplus, but each year the city will identify how much surplus funds that exist in each TIF district that they can declare that aren't being used. And so when that happens, CPS and other taxing bodies like the city, the parks, libraries, they get a share of that TIF surplus. And so this money can be used to support CPS operating budget, and that funds, teachers, that funds educators, school staff, student services, et cetera. There's also expiring TIF districts. And so when a TIF ends, CPS gets its share of any unspent surplus funds or any unspent or surplus funds. And then the growth in the property tax value inside that TIF district actually returns to the regular tax base. That increases the amount of property tax revenue that CPS can collect year over year. Now, all three of these mechanisms together, they all matter, and they all kind of interplay with each other, but they play different roles. And so tonight we're really going to be talking about how TIF has become a much bigger part of how Chicago Public Schools is funded. Now, the scale and size of TIF within CPS has changed a lot over the last few years, and we'll get into this a bit more in some future slides. But just a few years ago, just as an example, back in FY19, CPS's declared about $22 million in TIF surplus. This past year, FY26, this most recent school year, it was $379 million. So from 22 million to $379 million in about 7 years. That is a 1,600 or 1,600% increase in the amount of money that CPS is budgeting for TIF surplus since FY19. So TIF, you know, 5, 6 years ago made up about less than 1% of CPS's budget. Now it's about 6%. But we wanted to kind of put it in kind of more concrete terms in terms of the amount of TIF that is contributing to CPS. On top of that, even between 2020 and 2024, the city committed about $250 million in TIF funding to CPS for capital projects. So these are the building improvements. These are going to be your playgrounds, your annexes, your roof repairs, et cetera. So about $50 million a year. So those investments have helped make school buildings in Chicago more modern and more welcoming for students and staff as well. So the key point here is that TIF can be used in multiple ways. It can help build, rebuild, improve school buildings. It's also become tied to whether or not CPS can create a balance, can balance its budget. And that's why the debates about TIF now go straight to the heart of CPS's financial stability. So for tonight, our goal is not to turn everyone into a TIF expert, into a policy expert. Instead, we want to do three things clearly and honestly. So first, we want to explain what TIF is in plain language. Second, we're going to show how TIF decisions affect CPS funding. And the third, we're hoping to explain why TIF has become such a flashpoint in some of the recent CPS budget debates. After that overview, we're going to hear from people who work with these issues every day. We've got Alderwoman Nicole Lee, who brings that city council perspective from the 11th Ward. We've got Joe Ferguson from the Civic Federation, who is an expert on fiscal and governance issues. And we have Nell Salzman, who's going to moderate that panel from the New York Times. So most importantly, we want everyone here tonight, whether you're a parent, an educator, a community member to leave tonight with an understanding of why TIF matters, so that you can feel informed and prepared to engage and advocate when TIF comes up in future budget debates. With that, I will turn it over to Kids for Chicago CEO Daniel Nello, who I will support in terms of walking through the slides for the first portion of tonight. Daniel, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Hal. Thanks everyone who's come out today, and welcome to your introduction to tax increment financing. As Hal said, we're going to do an intentional kind of walkthrough 101. So for all of you experts who are here, particularly our panelists, just bear with us, but I think it won't take very long. But the idea is for us to really kind of hone in on what are TIFs. And to be quite honest, like TIFs have become a much more important thing for us to understand as they've ratcheted up. You saw that 1,600% increase. You can go to the next slide, Hal. So when you see the map on the left, many of you are familiar with it. It's a map of Chicago, right? And this is a TIF 101, but so I don't want to overwhelm you and make you think that we're going to start here, but I think it's important to understand how we look at Chicago, right? And the goal here is to understand what TIFs are, how they work. So on the left, what you see are 50 aldermanic wards that make up the city of Chicago. And on the right, you see the blue shaded areas, which represent all of Chicago's tax increment financing districts, the TIFs. And these districts, these TIF districts, they're typically aligned with commercial corridors, business areas, commercial streets, specific to specific parts of the city. And each one is financially tied to either the ward that it sits entirely within or proportionately across the wards that it may sit across. So some TIFs live exclusively in one ward, and at other times, a TIF can cross across multiple wards. You can go to the next slide. But as I said, this is going to be a 101. So we're going to keep it really simple. Next slide. And I just want you to imagine a city like Chicago, but instead of 50 wards, there's only two wards in it. We got Ward 1 and we got Ward 2. You can go to the next slide. And every year, each ward is collecting its property taxes as wards in the city does, right? And that's based on the people and the businesses that are within those wards, so Ward 1 and Ward 2. And for illustrative purposes, we're assuming here that each of these wards, Ward 1 and Ward 2, collect the same in taxes, represented by each of these green $1 bills. And by law, when those taxes are collected in Chicago, they have to be distributed across different public agencies according to the percentages you actually see here on the right. And these are taken from the city of Chicago. So roughly half of all the taxes that are collected across these wards, across this two-ward city, go to Chicago Public Schools. Another 20% go to the city, 7% to the Park District. You should be able to see kind of where they are. The remaining proportions are all distributed according to what you see in this pie chart. You can go to the next slide, Hal. So now imagine that in our fictitious Chicago, where there's two different wards, Ward 2, the city decides it's going to create a TIF district, which would typically look like what's shown here, right? Like an area that's a commercial area with surrounding streets that have been designated as part of this specific TIF district within that ward. So this is how it typically looks. Go to the next slide. But for the sake of just keeping this really simple, we're going to assume that the entire Ward 2 is a commercial property area and the entire region is designated as a TIF. So essentially, Ward 2, its boundary, and the Ward 2 TIF are identical geographically, right? The whole thing is a TIF. So now we have one ward, Ward 1, with no TIF, and Ward 2, which is completely a TIF district as well. Next slide. So what happens in these wards as we collect taxes? So right now we're in year 1, and Ward 1 doesn't have a TIF. Ward 2 is entirely a TIF district. And when TIF districts are created, the city freezes the property tax revenue for that area at its current level. This is called the baseline, right? So you see that on the right-hand side here. In year 1, both of our example wards contribute $1 in taxes each. And for Ward 2, that $1 becomes the baseline amount, which is important as we move into future years and property taxes begin to increase for both wards. You can go to the next slide. So even though the baseline's set, I think it's important to also just remind people that property taxes in Ward 2, they will be increasing over time. They don't just stay at that baseline. And they also will be increasing for Ward 1. However, any revenue that is collected above the baseline gets treated differently from the standard tax revenue. You can go to the next slide. So now we've moved to year 2 in our fictitious city, and tax revenue in each ward is increased by $1. And for simplicity, we're assuming that all of Ward 2 is also a TIF district. Remember, the whole thing is a TIF district. So in Ward 1, we have $2 represented by these green dollar bills that's distributed in the normal way, according to the law, and according to that pie chart that I showed you earlier. And in Ward 2, the additional dollar above the baseline, it doesn't flow through that standard tax distribution. That's why it's in red. So this extra dollar, shown here by the red dollar bill, this is called the TIF increment. And this increment is deposited into a TIF account because it represents tax revenue that's above that frozen baseline level that was set in year 1 when the TIF was created. You can go to the next slide. So now let's fast forward. We're in year 10. And at this point, property tax revenue, imagine, is $3 for each ward. Ward 1, which doesn't have any TIF district, all $3 are collected and distributed according to that pie chart. CPS gets its portion, parks, etc. And in Ward 2, the baseline amount, the original dollar, is also distributed in that standard way, but we have $2 in this TIF increment. You can go to the next slide. So everything above that baseline, these additional red $2 gets treated differently. And that portion of the TIF increment is directed into the TIF account rather than flowing through the usual tax distribution method. Next slide. And just a reminder, the green dollars are following this recipe of going to the various different areas that you see in the graph here. So what happens to the TIF increment? Go to the next slide, Hal. Sorry. What happens to this TIF increment? TIF dollars typically used to support infrastructure improvements, private investment. They all happen within the boundary of the TIF district. Hal spoke to this earlier about some of the things they can go to: fixing the pool, fixing the park, building a building, expanding a library. In our example, because the entire ward is a TIF district, any of the projects that they want to do throughout the ward, in an agreement between typically the alderperson and the city, would be able to use these additional red dollar bills that you see here, these TIF increment dollars. So TIF funds, they do rarely go to schools, at least in this way, but that's how they're distributed within the ward. Next slide. Okay, you're there. Now suppose Ward 2 spends only one of its 2 TIF increment dollars. So what happens to that unspent TIF increment, right? So the city can designate this unspent amount as a TIF surplus, and there's policies that determine how much of these uncommitted TIF dollars can be marked for surplus and swept by the city. Under that policy, which I think is on one of these slides, but I will speak it to you now. This is probably the most complicated my section will get, but basically the TIF districts with uncommitted funds have 25% of the balance over $750,000 that gets swept, and 100% of that balance over 2.5 million gets swept if it doesn't go used. But for simplicity's sake, in our example, we're going to say there's one unspent dollar of the 2 red dollars here, and that's treated as a surplus and it's swept by the city. You can go to the next slide. So the city sweep of uncommitted TIF funds helps support overall city budget and city agencies. That's where it's going to go. And note that the term TIF surplus and TIF sweep very often get used interchangeably. So while the surplus really just means the uncommitted TIF money, and the other actually means the action, the sweep, the action the city is taking, sometimes the way things get talked about is TIF surplus and TIF sweep are being used interchangeably. TIF increments can grow pretty large, and the unspent portion can accumulate and become pretty significant. And sweeps, they're ultimately intended to happen in coordination with the alderperson and the city, since there may be projects or things that are happening within a TIF district that haven't been committed to yet, where the alderperson's thinking, hey, next year's TIF dollars I'd like to put towards that library or something, a street or something they want to fix within their ward. But here's a critical point. Any TIF funds that city sweeps have to be distributed across public agencies according to that pie chart, the state statute that I showed you earlier. And this is just a different version of us breaking down very simply, but that distribution follows those same percentages. So 50% goes to CPS, 30% goes to these other different entities in Chicago, and then the remaining 20% go to the city of Chicago. So as you're thinking about the conversation that's about to happen, the panel discussion, keep in mind that this means that in our fictitious example, there's $4 of TIF. If CPS is budgeting to get $2 in TIF from TIF surpluses, that means that the city has to sweep $4. And vice versa, if the city is thinking we need to get $1 for the work that we need to do as a city, generally, then because they only get 20% of the TIF surplus, they need to sweep $5, which would mean that they get that $1 and 20%. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Danny Visecki from the Civic Federation to take you into kind of the 102, 201 version of what happens to TIFs, how they expire, et cetera. And then we'll go from there into what I think is probably the 401 conversation with our panelists.
Thank you, Daniel. Hello, everyone. My name is Danny. I'm a research associate with the Civic Federation. And like Daniel said, I'm going to dive a little bit more into some of the nuance of TIF. I know that Hal said we don't need everyone to walk away as an expert, but there is a lot of nuance to unpack here. So I'm going to try to focus on the stuff that is relevant to our conversation and to the public schools today. So moving on to our next slide. Under state law, TIFs have a lifespan of 23 years. That can get extended by an additional 12 years with approval from the City Council and from the State General Assembly. A lot of Chicago's TIFs were created in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So if you count forward, that means that a lot of them are nearing the end of their lifespan now, or recently neared the end of their lifespan and got renewed. When a TIF expires, all of the money that is left in that TIF that has built up over however many years, that gets surplused automatically. And then afterwards, all of the tax revenue that used to flow into that TIF that grew every year, it gets divided back up between all of the local governments that normally levy property taxes, including CPS. Moving on to the next slide. The amount of money that a TIF takes in each year depends on how big it is, how valuable the property within the TIF is, and how fast the value of that property is growing. So TIFs that see faster growth in property value take in more money. Older TIFs that have had more time to mature and have their property values grow see a lot more revenue than newer TIFs, which will often have small increments in their first few years. Wealthier areas also tend to generate a lot more TIF revenue and therefore generate much larger TIF surpluses. Reform ideas around TIF, there are quite a lot of them. They often tend to focus on fairness, transparency, and a more even distribution of TIF funding. This map here shows TIFs throughout the city of Chicago, and you can see that although they cover a lot of Chicago is also not covered by TIF. Moving on to the next slide. There are a few things, well, there are a lot of things actually that TIF funds cannot be used for. So TIF generally is supposed to be used to fund public infrastructure projects. That's things like road resurfacing, school maintenance, or park field houses. It can also frequently be used to incentivize private development or to provide public infrastructure that makes certain types of development easier. However, TIF funds cannot be used for operational expenses. So outside of that infrastructure and development funding, you cannot use TIF to pay for things like salaries or government employees. However, once TIF revenue is removed from a TIF and distributed to local governments through the surplus, then it can be used for anything, just like any other revenue that those local governments take in. On to our next slide. There are a lot of varying opinions about TIF, and this is probably something that will get expanded on a little bit in our panel, but just a few of the top bullet points here. Some of the pros, why people like TIF. They bring very visible improvements into neighborhoods, number one. They also help to attract investment in jobs within the area that the TIF covers, number two. And then third is that they can provide a lot of support for deteriorating public infrastructure. They can also support local governments like CPS and the Park District in improving some of their infrastructure. On the other hand, there are a lot of reasons people dislike TIF as well. Firstly, they tend to benefit already wealthier areas. So TIFs in wealthier areas are going to grow faster because the property values in those areas are going to grow faster, which means that those TIFs will then pull in more revenue and be able to spend more money within those areas. So they tend to benefit wealthier areas a little bit more. They're very complicated and not always very transparent. And they add uncertainty to budgeting for CPS and for some of the other local governments. And it's that last point that we're going to expand on a little bit if we move into our next slide. So, why is all of this stuff about TIF important specifically for CPS? Going on to our next slide. TIF surpluses have gotten very large over about the last decade. If you may remember, I said a little bit ago that a lot of Chicago's TIFs were created around the same time in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And every year, all of those TIFs have been growing more and more and more. And as they have gotten older and older, the total amount of money coming into those TIFs has grown every year. Each year, those TIFs capture more and more revenue, but there aren't that many more development projects and infrastructure projects to spend the TIF money on. This means that we're seeing larger and larger surpluses every year. And you can see from this chart that the total TIF surplus used to be around $200 million, which CPS would get about half of, so $100 million back in 2017. But in 2025, the surplus reached over $700 million, and CPS got $379 million last year. In 2026, if the proposed budget that's currently on the table goes through, CPS is projected to get over $500 million in TIF surplus. CPS's total budget is about $10 billion. So TIF surplus is 4 to 5% of that, which is a pretty big share. Now, if we move on to the next slide, the timing of TIF surplus, and this is a little technical, but it's important. The timing of TIF surplus is kind of difficult for CPS. CPS has to produce a balanced budget by the end of August every year. But the TIF surpluses don't actually get declared until the city of Chicago passes its budget, and it doesn't do that until all the way in the end of December. This means that every year, CPS basically has to guess what size TIF surpluses they're going to get. If they guess too low, then they'll have to make unnecessary cuts to balance the budget. But if they guess too high, then they'll end up with a mid-year deficit, which can mean mid-year cuts. This wasn't as big of a deal when surpluses were on the lower side, like at the lower end of that chart in the last slide. But now that they're such a large share of CPS's revenue, it's a bigger problem. CPS has dealt with this so far by just predicting last year's TIF revenue again pretty much each year. So since last year it got 379 million, it passed a budget for 2026, assuming that it would get 379 million again. But since TIF surpluses are constantly growing, that means that every year CPS is kind of lowballing the surplus that they're going to receive. On the other hand, as a lot of those TIFs reach the end of their lifespan, they're going to eventually start to expire, even if they get extended. When that happens, CPS will actually be at risk of over-predicting its surplus revenue, because eventually that revenue is going to start to decline. And if we can move on to the next slide here, we can sort of see a little chart of when TIFs are scheduled to expire. And you can see a large number expired in 25 and another dozen or so are slated to expire in 2026. And we see another very large spike in the early 2030s, around 23 and 4 and 5. So a lot of TIFs are scheduled to expire in the next couple of years. Some of those will probably get renewed, and then their expirations will be pushed to the mid 2030s. But almost all of the existing TIFs are going to expire by 2035 or 2036, even if they get renewed. Once that happens, the revenue that CPS gets from TIF surpluses and from expiring TIFs is going to start to decline. So that's all I've got. And moving on to the next slide, we have a Q&A.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Danny. I think just one thing I want to say from the very beginning is we know this is super complicated stuff. We know this is something that we've heard a lot from families and community members about wanting to learn more about. And so rest assured, we're going to send the recording from this webinar out tomorrow morning. The audio of your preferred language, English, Spanish, Chinese Mandarin, you'll be able to participate as well. So you will have this presentation with you that you can refer back to if you have any questions. But before we move on to the panel, we did want to open up and just see if there's anything in the chat that either Daniel or Danny might be able to address.
So there was the question I saw from Consuelo.
Yep.
It said, and I think I'm following what you're asking, Consuelo, but you said the dollars that don't go to the schools. There was a comment I said that a lot of the TIF surplus dollars don't necessarily go to schools. You asked, but why doesn't it go to all schools? Why are only some schools selected? So the projects that the TIF surplus goes to is determined by the alderperson and the city kind of in collaboration to determine where they're going to allocate it. It gets more complex when you have to determine whether or not a school is within a TIF district because the TIF district's funds that they're collecting have to be used for things that are within that district. So if TIFs, I mean, if schools exist outside of TIF districts, then they can't be beneficiaries the of the TIF. So in the example I was walking through, if you had two wards and one's a TIF district and one is not, for schools that are in Ward 1, they would never be able to benefit from any of the TIF surplus dollars that are collected in the other ward. That's the answer to that one, I think.
One just quick reminder. So we'll try to speak a little bit. I know we're getting some comments about just speaking a little bit more slowly, just for our interpreter to be able
Me.
to keep track. Because I know, and I know that our panelists will do so as well. But thank you, Daniel. We have a question around, doesn't expiring TIFs just mean the revenue goes back to the school? So if all TIFs were to expire, that would be better for overall CPS revenue, right? That's what the
Um,
question. That's what the question is.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll take this question because this is a very technical issue. So the thing about expiring TIFs is that CPS, when it is normally raising property taxes, it has what's called a tax cap under this state law that stops CPS from raising its property tax levy by more than the rate of inflation or 5% each year, whichever is less. There are some exceptions in that law, however, and TIF is one of those exceptions. So revenue from TIF surpluses or revenue from expiring TIFs is basically an exception from that PTEL law. So every year, CPS will always raise its total property tax levy by up to the cap imposed by PTEL. It's done so almost every single year for the last several decades, which means that TIFs don't really take money away from CPS, but TIF surpluses and expiring TIFs actually allow CPS to partially evade the tax caps that are in place. Now, when these TIFs expire, CPS will be able to bring that revenue back in, and that will be an exception. But when there are less TIFs expiring every year and there are lower TIF surpluses, one of the tools that CPS uses to sort of evade these tax caps is going to go away. So it will have less of an ability to do that, which will, in the long term, mean that it will not be able to raise property taxes by as much and therefore not take in as much revenue each year.
Thank you, Dan. I know there's a question. I saw Daniel. Why do we use TIF at all? Why do we even do TIF? And I think we're going to hold that one for the panel conversation because as much as I'd love to hear Daniel and Danny's response, I'd also love to hear Alderwoman Lee's response as well as Joe's response. Why don't we do maybe one or two more questions? A question around this is Danny. Maybe you might want to, but why are there such large TIF surpluses? Wouldn't the alders want to use those funds for projects in the ward?
Yeah, so I think that
And
there's a
you might
lot
want
of
to ask this
different.
one in the panel too. I mean, just to be clear, it
Yeah, I
might be a
think
good
that
one for
this
the
is
panel.
this is a good one for the panel.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different components to it. These the size of these TIFs is really not to be underestimated. They grow almost exponentially, especially some of the largest ones. And so I think it's possible to get to a point where you can almost like you can see like hundreds of millions of dollars flowing into a decent sized TIF every year. And even a pretty active alder with a lot of different development projects might not be able to find things to spend all of that on. So there's a part there. There's also some TIFs where there is more and some TIFs where there's less interest in doing overall development. And since there's fair restrictions around what you can use TIF for, you can use it for public infrastructure projects, you can use it for incentivizing private development projects. Those are all things that take a while to plan. You can't just sort of snap your fingers and say, well, I have a lot of TIF revenue to spare. How about I, like rebuild some public building or something like that? There's a lengthy process that all those proposals have to go through. And so if a lot more revenue comes in a given year, it's not necessarily easy for the alder or the city government or the other local governments that might benefit from TIF to get all of that money set into projects that immediate year. But I think there's a lot more nuance to this question so it should definitely go back to the panel as well.
Yeah, I see some other questions around how TIF districts are drawn. Have there been misappropriation of TIF funds? I think our former city inspector general might be able to answer that question. Our current investigative fellow. So I think I'm going to use my prerogative. I think as the MC tonight. I think to move us into the panel, if that's all right
Yeah.
for Danny and for Daniel.
Yeah,
Daniel.
I was gonna say how I'm also seeing a lot of folks they're using the chat as a
Okay.
place to
All
drop
right.
questions, so I'm trying to capture those as well. But if you can use the Q&A for your questions for those who are it's easier for us to track all of them and make sure some of the panelists get to hear them. But I agree with moving to the panel.
Perfect. All right. Um, well, thank you, Danny and Daniel. I think you've provided all of us with a great introduction to TIF and specifically around how TIF surplus works and how that's been connected to CPS. We are now going to introduce our panel for this evening. We are very lucky to have Nell Salzman, who is currently an investigative fellow at the New York Times, actually researching on TIF in Chicago. So no one better, I think, to be moderating tonight's discussion. She formerly was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. You probably saw her name on bylines in the past, focusing on immigration education in the city. She used to work at KTNA Radio in Alaska and Westward, which is a local news outlet in Denver. She was a 2024 Livingston Award finalist for her reporting on a Venezuelan migrant family's journey from El Paso to Chicago. Her fellowship is funded by the Richard Dreyhouse Foundation, which is an Illinois-based nonprofit that supports investigative reporting at the state or local level. We are also joined by Alderwoman Nicole Lee, who is the Alderwoman for the 11th Ward. She was appointed originally in March of 2022 before being elected in 2023. She made history as the first Asian American woman and Chinese American to serve on the Chicago City Council. Born and raised in Chicago's Chinatown community, she's an established leader in the Chinese American and Asian American communities through her volunteerism and involvement in a number of local organizations. Prior to becoming Alderwoman, Alderwoman Lee spent nearly 15 years with United Airlines, where she served as the Director for Social Impact Optimization and Global Community Engagement. In that role, she led the team accountable for building the company's global nonprofit partnerships and spearheading the strategy around humanitarian aid and disaster response. She's held positions in both the public and private sectors, including as development officer at Premier Bank, program officer at BP America Inc., and as an independent consultant specializing in community relations, social investment, and corporate social responsibility. Alderwoman Lee is a graduate of Whitney Young High School, and she's been an active participant in her children's schools, including having served on the local school council at Haynes Elementary School. She obtained her bachelor's degree from Indiana University's School of Public and Environmental Affairs and her master's of public policy from the local University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. Finally, Joe Ferguson is the president of the Civic Federation. Previously, Joe had served as the inspector general for the city of Chicago from 2009 to 2021. He was first appointed by former Mayor Richard M. Daley and twice reappointed by former Mayor Rahm Emanuel. Under his leadership, the Chicago Office of Inspector General doubled its staff from 50 to over 100 employees, and expanded the scope of its work, earning national acclaim for its government performance audits and audit-based evaluations. Prior to becoming Inspector General, Ferguson spent 15 years with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. He teaches at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and is a founding co-director and lecturer of the Loyola University School of Law National Security and Civil Rights Program. He was recently a Pritzker Fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics. In addition, he's the founder of Chicago, a strategic initiative to assess and address flaws in the city's governance structure. He has his BA from Lake Forest College and his JD from Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law. With that, I will turn it over to Nell, and I'm actually going to take down the slides so we can see our three panelists if they are able to turn on their cameras. Thank you. Nell, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Hal. Can you hear me okay?
That's great.
Great. Welcome, parents and family members. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thanks to Hal for having me to talk about one of the most powerful and I would say least understood forces shaping our city today. My name's Nell. I'm moderating discussion between Joe and Alderman Lee. And I think I'm really excited to have both of them here tonight because I think they'll both bring really unique perspectives to our conversation. Lee, with her background in both private and nonprofit sectors, which I think are both key players in how TIF works, and Ferguson with his extensive experience looking into different facets of city government. As Hal mentioned, I used to cover, Chicago public schools for the Chicago Tribune. My interest in TIF was originally piqued because former CEO of CPS, Pedro Martinez, was always pointing to these TIF diversions that Daniel just laid out in his presentation as one of the root causes of the school district's budget shortfalls. Um, so I've spent the past several weeks looking into different aspects of this system, who benefits and who loses, what is good about it, and what could be improved. And I think a big part of the conversation is the way that schools are or are not affected by it. This is a quick reminder, right? When a city creates a TIF district, it freezes the tax base at its current level. And any additional tax revenue generated by rising property values is set aside in district-specific funds that can only be used for projects in those areas. They're kind of like separate piggy banks. I like to think about using words that everyone can understand when talking about TIF because, everyone reading about TIF, journalists use words like increment and locks and freezes, and that can be really hard for an average parent to understand, I think. So let's just start with that first question, right? This idea of money away from schools. I want to hear from both of you guys on this. But if your property taxes go up because of a new development in that area, right? In an area that is a TIF designated district, is a school district blocked from getting that new money for 23 years? In other words, does TIF actually take money away from schools? Let's just start with that question.
Joe, rock, paper, scissors?
You start on this one, and I just want to say, Nicole, I'm glad to see you vertical after the day that you've just been through in the city council, which is an extraordinary day, and the contemporary history of the city, folks, as the city council actually moved forward with an alternative budget that is something that has not been even attempted in decades. And it's an incredibly both delicate and complex process. And so Alderwoman Lee comes to us at the end of a day about as long as could be imagined for her. So we're grateful for her to be here.
Thanks for that, Joe. I appreciate it. I assume that you were watching the whole time, and that's hours of your life you will never get back. To your specific question, Nell, if your property values go up because of a new development, and you're in a TIF district, does that take money away from the schools? That was your question. I just want to make sure I was clear on that.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you can certainly look at it that way, because that is, if you're in a TIF district at all, if your property's in a TIF district, any additional money or additional tax revenue above that base year is put in the little piggy bank for TIF dollars, or it's the TIF piggy bank for that district. There is opportunity if your school is within that district to access those funds. And we've used TIF dollars in the 11th ward to do new ADA compliant elevators and entrances. I think Holden Elementary School is one example. In other cases, we've done roof repairs. The fact is that not every TIF district, not every school falls within a TIF district. And that in and of itself becomes very challenging. So, for instance, in the 11th ward, I wasn't around for when the maps were drawn. So I'm living with whatever was established originally. Really big point of frustration for me as a new alder was looking at the map to see how many schools actually fell outside of the TIF district. Because if you're outside, we can't use the funds. Those are the rules of the TIF. Now, if TIFs border each other, and there is a school, let's say, in the neighboring TIF, it's still in the ward. It doesn't even matter if it's in the ward, but like if it's a neighboring TIF and that neighboring TIF doesn't make as much money, doesn't generate as much increment, but the one over here does, you can do what's called porting. You can port money from one TIF to another so long as they're touching. So, porting is something I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later. But to the short answer the long answer to your very short question is yes, that's certainly a way that you can look at it. And I'm interested in Joe's perspective on this as well.
So, and maybe I can frame it for you in a way that's
Yeah.
a little more helpful for people. I guess like one way to think about it is, what do you think schools are giving up when TIF deals are approved? For example, when a city approves a large TIF deal, what might be the specific trade-off for CPS at that moment?
So I have a slightly different calibration of the lens on the question.
Totally good.
Because, and I would say to what, I don't stand on ceremony, so I'm going to call Alderwoman.
Call me Nicole.
Nicole.
It's fine.
Yeah. And so is that it's simply not available. The increment is not available to the school. And you can look at that as a loss, or you can look at that as something you're just never going to receive. Because if the district didn't exist, or if what would happen is, so all of these units of government, and there was a question in the chat earlier, why doesn't CPS get it all, right? It's because there's all of these different taxing governmental bodies that do what's called levies. And the levy isn't a percentage, it's a fixed dollar approval of property taxes, and they all get lumped together. And that's the entirety of the overall tax levy, what we pay. That gets distributed across the city in terms of obligation and burden. We're not going to get into that mess. If the TIF district didn't exist, the increment didn't exist, what would happen is the value of that increment would simply be folded into this larger calculation of the overall assessed value for the district and across the city. And CPS can only raise the levy so much each year. There's a cap, there's a percentage. And so what's happening is that there is a smaller tax base because a certain portion of the tax base has been set aside. That levy continues, and everyone pays the same taxes, which CPS year after year after year levies to the maximum amount that's allowed by law. And then the TIF district basically is an additional tax that we're paying that is set aside, right? But the base that goes to CPS is the same. If you took away the district, it would simply be that levy would be distributed over a larger assessed value, a larger tax base. So it's money that is not available rather than taken away from CPS. Nell, you asked us, you reformulated the question. And I'm just wondering if you would just restate it again so I could kind of go directly to the essence of that, unless you feel like I've answered the question.
Yeah, no, I think that was a great summary of it, right? Like, in other words, there is a fund of money that could have paid for computers or teachers or whatever else. Instead, it's being used by the city for development projects. But that doesn't mean that less money is going to schools, because there are different ways
Right.
the city funds its schools.
We pay more property taxes because of TIF. We pay more property taxes and don't get the full benefit of that in terms of the money going to the taxing district directly, because we've set aside a portion of it.
Right. And so the question I asked you about opportunity cost, I think about these discussions like when we're thinking about the way that we fund different entities, parks, schools, as trade-offs and opportunity costs, that economic term, opportunity cost, right? But I guess when a city chooses to put that money toward a large deal, what might be the specific trade-off for CPS at that moment?
Well, the money that the city is putting towards the large deal is this captured money from the increment in the district. And so CPS isn't losing anything in that moment. Alders who have schools in their district and where there are needs absolutely should be looking. There was one person that asked the question, is there a list of what schools are in what TIF districts? And what a great question. Actually, the answer is no, there is not a list, and it's a very easy list to create, and everybody should know that so that they can ask their alder, hey, our school has need. Are you thinking about pitching for TIF dollars to be applied directly to those needs, but the information isn't quite there. I don't think that there's actually a trade-off at the front end of all of this. And something that two things that I think are really important to put on the table foundationally for everybody. This has less to do with TIF and more to do with how the state of Illinois funds public education. We fund it through property taxes. Over 50% of all of the operating revenue for CPS, and this was in the PowerPoint, comes from property taxes. And property taxes and what we yield from property taxes is unequal from district to district across the state. And so it's an inequitable and not optimal way of funding public education. That's the first thing. Second is, again, we rely for a high percentage of CPS operating costs on that inferior form of revenue generation and taxation. So that's really important to understand. TIF is an overlay on top of that. And the other thing that is really important to understand is it's referred to by some as a slush fund. It's not a slush fund. It is an economic development tool. And the idea is that it is one of the tools that we use to invest community by community to generate the infrastructure needed to support economic development and economic development itself to actually make for a better community. And school districts exist in those communities. So if we took this TIF away tomorrow, we'd have to come up with another economic development tool.
Absolutely. And I think I want to turn to Alderman Lee, or I'm just going to say Nicole. I'm going to turn to Nicole because I want to talk about that. What Joe was just saying, the benefits of having a community level decision making process. And now there's a lot of parents on this, call tonight. I want to know how you see in your ward who decides what TIF approvals, go through city council, and can parents influence it,
We figure out where to start to answer that question because I think it varies, right? There's no set of rules or city policies that say or that mandate community engagement be part of the discussion as far as what gets approved for TIF projects. I think you mentioned earlier, some people look at a TIF and think of it as a slush fund. A slush fund to me is something you can go to right away and like use whenever you want. TIF is like the opposite of that, actually. It is a rather complicated system that I can't say that I totally have 100% grasp on for how it works in the city because, the 11th ward is part of probably a half a dozen different TIF districts. And they range in projects from infrastructure, like working on bridges. I have a very industrial part of my ward in the stockyards. The Halsted Street Bridge, 18th Street Bridge, these are all major infrastructure projects that CDOT often taps for resources. It's not the only source, but it certainly is one of them. Other things that get funded are park projects as well as school improvements, should they fall into the schools. And then affordable housing is yet another one that often gets taps TIF funds for. You've probably seen in the news conversations around like the 78 and building new stadiums and other big sort of developments. When projects like that when we're trying to develop big projects, you need money from the tax base to help sort of fund big infrastructure changes or larger developments, help get those off the ground. I'm not part of the 78. It's right next door. It's just to the north. So I do have an interest, but I don't touch that. And in fact, most of that area that's not already sort of cordoned off in the TIF over there is part of the Red Line Extension TIF. That Red Line Extension TIF, a little bit different, but still funding a big, huge project, which is the extension of the Red Line to the far south side of Chicago to create connection point for residents on the far south side to come downtown and connect to everything else. It is complex. I would say that older people certainly have the opportunity to start the conversation about projects they are interested in funding, but also other units of government, as I said, like CDOT or the Chicago Park District, CPS included, as well as the Department of Planning and Development when it comes to economic development opportunities. So annually, a small business improvement fund generally comes out of most of these TIFs, which is a small fund of about $1 million that small businesses within the corridor, within the boundaries of the TIF, can apply for small grants to make improvements like, adding security shutters or opening up a window so they can have a patio, things like that. The grants are generally no more than $250,000 in those cases. I gave you a lot of information. I'm not sure that I answered the question though, Nell. Sorry.
So
Yeah.
Nell, there's one great question that popped up that I think
Yeah.
is great for demystification about the role of alders.
Absolutely.
And it's if there are 3 or 4 schools close to each other in a TIF district and they all need improvements, can the alder person decide which one to help first or deny them all? What's the degree of control that an alder actually has? It's a great demonstration of like that right
Yeah.
there.
I mean, so I'll take a shot at answering it. I wish I knew of a situation that existed like that, but let's say that it did, and it was in the 11th ward. I think those conversations would absolutely include and engage myself and the folks at CPS, the principals, to just understand. Also, I don't manage the real estate portfolio of the Chicago public school systems, so it could be so in the 11th ward. I have the oldest school building in the entire district, Ward School, Ward Elementary School, in Armour Square. And it is very landlocked. They need parking. They could use a playground. Part of when the weather's nice and the kids need recess outside, they close the street off. So they have space. There's really not a whole lot of space for them to grow. But looking at some of the other needs, that's where the conversation really is with CPS and their real estate folks to understand sort of what dollars they have for capital improvements. But generally speaking, I feel like and you can keep me honest here, Joe, you might know this better than I do, just sort of at the global level. But I do, it does appear that very often if there are TIF dollars available, CPS is definitely coming to the city to try to tap those TIF funds to help with the major infrastructure and school improvement projects.
I think it brings in a question, though. It really does bring in this idea of equity and fairness, and this idea of who benefits and who doesn't, which has come up time and again in the questions that people have asked in the chat and also in the presentations. Do you think, Joe, in your view of studying TIF for the course of the time that you've looked at it, or seen it kind of progress, do you think that TIF dollars are reaching the schools and the neighborhoods with the greatest need?
I'm going to go to the place of the greatest need, right? And then by implication, that would include schools in areas of greatest need. And the reason that TIF is deeply questioned and is controversial for many people is that by law, TIF districts are supposed to be created to eradicate and overcome, and this is the word that's used, blighted areas, blighted districts. And by just simply the general definition of that term, what we're talking about are, for any number of reasons, really disinvested places that have decayed in some fashion. Maybe they have a history and it's sort of been in decline. Maybe something's happened where it's just sort of been decimated in some respect. But we have defined, or we have applied the term blight to allow us to invest in the West Loop. Big development in the West Loop. And most people in the South and West Side would say, I don't care what the state of the area was in the West Loop immediately adjacent to the loop, or the 78 immediately south of the loop, or Lincoln Yards north of the loop. These are areas where the capacity exists because of their proximity to the loop and because of their proximity to existing infrastructure, where there doesn't need to be public investment of a significant amount being prioritized. That private interest can take care of that business. We need it in the south and west side. And so there are examples where you would go, that's not blight. Why are we doing big developments when we are trying to overcome disinvestment in other parts of the city? And if you're in a school, and everybody, I think people understand this, the average age of a Chicago public school building is 84 years old. And the total estimate of investment that's needed to bring all of that infrastructure, put aside whether we need all that infrastructure, but to bring it all up to contemporary standards, is $14 billion. So why are we making it more easy for big developers close to downtown to actually do their developments when we have all of this need? And that is the equity perception, and because there's a significant portion of reality attached to it. Is that fair, Nicole?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, the reality is that the way TIF is set up to work is if an area is actually blighted, it's going to take more time, presumably, for the TIF, the increment to build up. I think that's inherently part of one of the many imperfections about the program. We know that in areas where we have TIFs that are well performing, it's not always just about the increasing real estate value of like the homes in the area, but we have industrial areas too that fall into TIFs, right? I'm part of the Pilsen Industrial Corridor and the Pilsen Industrial TIF, which has a lot of industry around it, and it generates a lot of increment. I mean, I want to say it's over $100 million. No, I'm sorry, it's not over $100 million. It's about $40 million a year that generates in that corridor. And that's certainly, as Nell, as you're studying TIFs, you know that there's some work going on in that TIF area as well, with the need for affordable housing in Pilsen, and then that corridor where, frankly, it's becoming less and less industrial. Chinatown is sort of extending north and a little bit west there as we sort of head into the South Loop, really in the near South area and butting up against Pilsen. There's definitely there's not balance. Now, TIF is but one of several tools in the tool belt that the Department of Planning and Development and the city have. We recently did, in the last couple of years, the major economic development bond for economic development and housing, which offers an additional tool. The idea behind that was, as we're sunsetting TIFs, we have funds that are sort of freeing up to just pay this bond essentially. Downside to that is that it's schools are not eligible. Schools and parks are not eligible for those funds. So this whole conversation about what the needs of the schools and in the district are, and the needs are great. We know that. Like as I said, I have some schools that are in TIFs and most that are not. So it becomes very challenging, to say the least, because we are fighting for a very small amount of capital dollars that the district has for itself.
Absolutely. There's so many issues you touched on there, Alderman Nicole. I think are great. I mean, I think you were talking about basically the idea that TIF funds go to wealthier and faster growing areas, right? Because there might be more investment
they generate TIF increment faster.
Exactly. And that's one of the fundamental contradictions of TIF. It's almost like equity issues are baked into the language of the legislation. I want to talk about the 84-year-old building thing, Joe. When I was reporting on CPS, obviously over and over and over again, you hear about broken lockers and toxic schools, and there's problems with lead, and we know that those environments affect our kids, right? And so I want to spend a moment on school buildings and repairs. I think about TIF in relation to CPS. There are two ways that CPS gets TIF funds, right? They get the district gets TIF funds for building repairs, projects big and small, and then surplus or expiring TIF districts. And so I want to know from either of you, how important you think TIF money is for making those big repairs, and then what's going to happen to the buildings when that source of funding starts to disappear.
So this implicates the question of how you can use TIF surplus. Yeah, investments can be made in the schools from decisions of what to do with TIF money. They're particular investments in particular schools. They're projects for which a request is made and they're approved. But the money can only be used for limited purposes if we're talking about a TIF decision. When we have a surplus situation that is swept and the money goes to CPS, it's not dedicated to those infrastructure things. It can be used for operating expenses, all sorts. And CPS, over time, and in Danny's presentation, I think captured this, we've been doing TIF surpluses and sweeps for only about 10 years. This will be the 11th consecutive year that we do it. It was very small to begin with, and now this year it is massive. And CPS relies upon an assumption that it will receive these ever-growing larger amounts in the form of these sweeps of surplus to balance its regular operating budget. And really, in some fashion, since TIF originally is and in a dedicated fashion is supposed to be used for infrastructure, and a lot of what CPS needs is infrastructure investment, one could say, hey, when you sweep, it has to go to the infrastructure needs of the system, right? That would be a pretty significant force amplifier to addressing the degraded state of things. But if we did not have both TIF generally and TIF in this dedicated fashion to the schools, one thing that folks should understand is what the city would need to do is borrow money for economic development. We're not drawing upon a pool of money that's been set aside, would have to borrow, issue bonds, pay interest. And so that's where a lot of the complexities come in. Without it, we are diminished in our capacity to build the infrastructure and to promote economic development. And with it, we have this strange scenario where it's been set up where there's now this ever increasing wash of money over to CPS, but it's not going for the purpose that the TIF set aside was actually created for.
Right. And just to be clear, older people have no control over what happens to TIF swept or surplus dollars that go back to CPS. Right. That in this current TIF sweep that's been proposed, it's a little over $1 billion. CPS budgeted for 379 million of that. And we have an agreement between the two agencies, the CPS and the City of Chicago, that any increment that they receive that's above 379 million, with a cap of no more than 175 million extra on top of that 379, would come back to the city to pay for the pension fund that the city's obligated for, but they are for CPS workers at the end of the day. So, it makes for very strange bedfellows at the end of the day. And this is not a sustainable clip that we're going at right now. So, the funds that are going to CPS, the 379 is what's budgeted for in the school's budget. I mean, I had principals calling me, asking me to vote on a budget proposal because they were told that if I didn't vote for the budget, they would not be able to do the things that they budgeted for. And I cleared that up for them. 379 million is the amount that was budgeted for. That was never in question about what they were going to receive. And the full amount is going to CPS, and the city will get back something on the order of, I think, 173 million against that 175 pension payment.
And one other important thing that I think people should understand is the city council, the city of Chicago, doesn't decide what the percentage is of the money that's going back to CPS. It doesn't decide how that money gets used. These are all formulas, and actually the distribution of the declared surplus, the city declares the surplus, right? That's a formula. There's a little bit of mysteriousness about that formula, and it shifts over time. The alders don't get to decide that. That's one. Two, the surplus is declared, it goes proportional to all of the taxing agencies. Who decides what the proportion is? That's another formula, but that's done by the clerk. That's done by the city clerk working under a state sort of rubric of how you're supposed to do that calculation. And people blame alders for a lot of this when they actually have zero decision-making authority other than to approve the surplus sweep. That's it. Surplus declared by determined by the city budget director and the mayor's office. Sweep decided by the city council. The actual distribution of the sweep decided at the county level on the basis of state law.
And to be clear, the sweep is not a separate vote. It is all rolled up in the budget process. So it's not like I can just say yes on the sweep and no on something else separately. It's all packaged together.
Nicole, do you think that surplus decisions, how do you think that surplus decisions could be made, or the process of making a surplus decision, so that CPS can budget more responsibly, right?
Well, it's an interesting question. How could we do that so that CPS could, we're never privy to the process, as Joe just said. So, from the aldermanic perspective, when I'm given a number for each of the TIFs that I'm a part of what's going to be swept, I can look at it like, oh, okay, I don't have any upcoming projects that we're working on right now. Like, I feel like that would be okay. For the 35th and Halsted TIF in particular, we've been working on a new field house at Donovan Park. And we've gone so far as to have community meetings. We've had some drawings done. We were just getting ready to start the process of hiring an architect to design the building, getting engineering contracting work done, but it had not gone to the committee, which would have had to put this sort of on the board, if you will, against that 35th and Halsted TIF to essentially encumber the funds or to allocate them out of the TIF. And because that hadn't happened yet, it wasn't counted. It wasn't counted as a project that was already sort of queued up. And so, that was one of my biggest gripes about the surplus in that particular TIF for me in my district, was that I didn't want that to cause further delays in a project that, frankly, my constituents have been, working on since before I was an alder person. That TIF is going to be swept and will only have $1.5 million left in it for a very large area. And it'll build up. Look, there's no doubt it will build back up over time. But there was no conversation, which I think is problematic. Like, at least I could have flagged that. The administration doesn't actually talk to the Department of Planning and Development, who's been part of many of these conversations with us. So I think that it could be much improved. I can't speak to the kind of conversations that are going on between the administration and CPS itself. So, I mean, you'd have to ask the mayor or somebody at CPS about that. We're simply not privy to it. I certainly think that, there should be more engagement with older people and the staffs from the various agencies who are already working on projects together, even if they haven't met sort of the current minimum criteria for encumbering funds off of a particular TIF.
I I know that we're reaching time, so I just wanna bring in kind of a forward-looking question at the end, thinking about, CPS has a lot of transitions coming up. It's transitioning to, a fully elected school board, and it's trying to disentangle its finances with the city. Um, and then, as we've spent many minutes talking about TIF, showing that really CPS and the city are very connected in many ways, and development is right at the heart of it. And so I want you guys to um, tell parents, what are the key things they should be watching closely over the next couple of years, as these conversations and as these different changes move forward?
That's a great question. So the district operates with a structural deficit. The budget, there's a balanced budget, but it's technically balanced every year. And that structural deficit is going to need to be addressed through a combination of resetting of the disparity in how the teachers' pension fund is supported by the state. The statewide, across all other districts, the state funds 98% of the teachers' pension funds for all the other districts. For CPS, it's about 35%. The difference amounts to about $600 million a year right now. CPS's structural deficit is about $600 to $700 million a year right now. Okay, so that's one thing. Second, this never-ending dispute, or feels like a never-ending dispute, between about whether CPS should pay this reimbursement for municipal employee benefit fund employees, the non-teacher employees pension fund. The law is it's the city's obligation. Right now, CPS has agreed to pay the city $175 million in a reimbursement when CPS needs the money, right? So that system needs to be fixed as a matter of law, not just in terms of who owes that money into the system, but who has the levy or the taxing authority for that. So those are two really big things that need to be addressed, but more closely at the ground level. I think this question of capital infrastructure needs of schools, the actual environment that children are in, needs to be understood both holistically and how it affects individual schools. If you have seen one TIF district, you've seen one TIF district. If you have seen one school, you have seen one school. They're all different. And one of the reasons for that is we don't have holistic global planning that actually allows for inclusion of the population into the question of what we're going to prioritize, right? And so then we get into all of these disputes. I would look to see if there is actual signs of meaningful relationship and dialogue between the interim CEO and the governor, whether there are signs in Springfield in the coming few months in the spring session of real elevation and engagement of the crisis the CPS is dealing with ahead of the budget season, and whether or not there actually is, rather than these sort of transactional disputes, kind of a full accounting by CPS with the unions for actually its fiscal situation overall, so that priorities can be set holistically, globally, not as a matter of competition between districts, between schools, between different factions at different levels of government.
Nicole, do you want to share a few thoughts quickly? You're muted.
I know I'm muted. I just couldn't get over there fast enough. Joe gave a very fulsome answer there. I think, I'll go around the edges where I feel like as I am a CPS parent, by the way. I still have one kid in CPS. He's a junior in high school. And they've been CPS kids for a really long time. I think as the landscape is changing with the fully elected school board coming and this issue of the disentanglement of finances between CPS and the city of Chicago, I would encourage parents to talk to their older people, talk to their state representatives and their state senators. This is a decision that is going to be made downstate. It's not going to be up to the city of Chicago. I mean, I want to hear from constituents always, but the decision-making power is really at the state level. So state representatives and state senators are going to be really important in this. where CPS is holding any town halls, and if you go to your local school, make your voices heard that way. As I talk to constituents and I'm out talking to folks about just sort of the state of things, it's not, look, it's far from perfect. And a lot needs to be done because of all of the things that Joe has already talked about, the structural imbalances, and really the way that decisions are made, that where there are a small number of people and decision makers who are making these decisions that impact literally tens of thousands of families in the Chicago public school system, including all of yours. So I would say the way the money's going to be sort of divvied up at some point. Big question looming for me is what is that? What do we do with TIFs, right? I mean, we are since the beginning of this administration, we've been taking a little bit of a different direction. We're sunsetting more TIFs, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, right? I think that when we did the red line extension TIF, CPS was excluded from. We didn't take the increment away from CPS, so the increment is on top of. CPS gets its share of the tax levy from whatever people are paying, and the CPS share isn't going into the TIF. I think that there's still conversations about potential new TIFs. We haven't stopped. We haven't said that we're going to stop completely. I think we are being much more judicious. Excuse me, it's been a long day. Judicious as a city as to where we're either amending or creating new. But I think we are looking at a much more sort of diverse population of options. But I would say that anything new should look like the red line extension TIF, where the schools are being kept whole on what they're supposed to be getting from the levy.
One
Joe,
last
go ahead.
thing. I have a finger up.
Yeah, finger up. There is a point of misunderstanding and misperception that I think people really should have clarified in their minds. And I'm not going to make Nicole speak to this. In all of the controversy around the city's budget, there has never, ever been a question about whether the TIF surplus that's been proposed will be passed as part of the budget. There has been discussion about small marginal changes, but at the margin, but never anything that would bear upon CPS's need and expectation for what it budgeted for. It's simply not part of the discussion. Hasn't been, isn't right now, as we're running up against the deadline. And the place that I won't ask Nicole to confirm, but she can if she wants, is that there's going to be a budget. There's going to be a budget. And there is a lot of fear mongering over whether we're going to have a budget and what it means if we don't have a budget. We are going to have a budget, and it's going to involve the largest TIF sweep in history, which means the largest transfer of money to CPS in history, well in excess of the amount it's actually budgeted for. If we could take the energy of that issue out of all of the questions and conversation, my God, we might actually solve some things.
I think about, go ahead.
I will just say thank you, Joe. I have not been keeping up with the chat, but my sense is that the people have been asking some questions there. Our proposal does not touch the TIF sweep. We've kept intact exactly what the mayor's asked for in that TIF sweep, and that has never been in question. As I mentioned earlier, that I was asked by a principal about whether or not my vote on a budget was going to determine whether or not their school would get funding. That was simply not true. There has been a lot of fear mongering going on. That's never been in question. Never, not once.
And Nicole, we will let you, I know you're literally working as we speak, so we will let you get back to that. I wanted to add one last thing, which is that as I've been wading through all these documents, one of the things that I keep thinking about is how inconsistent this information is. And one of the questions in the chat was basically, if I were to track which schools are getting money and how much money, is there a way to do that? And there are a lot of documents posted on the city's website, but it's not easy to track, for example, how much money is going to specific developers or specific entities. And so I think these are issues that we're just waiting out together. And so I really appreciate Joe and Nicole tonight for kind of helping in that vein of transparency and talking about the facts and the different political discussions behind this. I think, there's a tension, right, between TIF as a necessary catalyst for development, and then also as a tool that does take money and put it toward development and not other taxing priorities.
And there is Nell. There is not just a movement, but an initiative afoot to actually have in the course of 2026. And I think you have some sense of some of who may be working on some of this. It's not ripe yet, but a comprehensive, user-friendly, interactive, accessible data platform that allows you to see by district all sorts of things that historically we would have to go and hunt and scrape and put and stitch together and put in sort of these static documents that then no one knows where they are. I think you can look forward to that changing in 2026.
Yeah, I'll leave with just this last comment or thought, right? As we're thinking about how CPS disentangles finances with the city of Chicago, while the TIF system as it exists today is far from perfect. If you are a school that falls within a TIF, you have a much better chance of getting funding to help your school than you would if you were just a CPS school not in a TIF district, because then you're competing with a lot of other competing needs. So that is the one thing that I'll just sort of leave sitting out there for people to chew on, is, how do we create a system that is more equitable, that helps to prioritize really funding where the funding is needed the most, not necessarily where the most resources are available. I really appreciate the invitation to join you all tonight. Thank you, Kids First, for putting on such a really informative discussion around TIF as it relates to schools.
Yeah,
Ditto
thanks,
that.
Ciao.
Yes. Well, I just want to thank, I mean, it is amazing that here we are at 7:05, and we've got, I think, peaked at about 150, 160 people here talking about TIF, talking about Chicago Public Schools. I want to first thank really everyone who made tonight possible. So I want to thank Civic Federation for bringing their expertise. They helped to break down really a complex topic like TIF in a way that was grounded, clear, focused on what it means for CPS. I want to thank the Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community. CBAC has been an essential partner to Kids First Chicago. They co-hosted this conversation. They shared the opportunity with their community. They've also made sure that families could fully participate through the translation and the language access. So thank you for that. A special thank you to Alderwoman Nicole Lee and to Joe Ferguson for their time and their insight this evening, and also to Nell Salzman for your just terrific guiding the conversation so thoughtfully tonight. So thank you all. I also want to thank all of you. First and foremost, this conversation does not end tonight. We're going to be following up with resources. We'll be following up with the recording, any next steps for folks who want to stay engaged. Again, this is, I think we maxed out at about 150, 160 people here talking about Chicago Public Schools, talking about TIF, very complex topic, and you all spent your evening with us, and we appreciate that, and we're very thankful. And this was, I think, a wonderful conversation, not just about public education, but it was an education of the public about TIF that we really appreciated your attendance here tonight. So we hope that you'll join future webinars. This is not going to be our last conversation about this topic. As trainings come up, as other advocacy opportunities come up, we hope that you will join us to help make sure that students are at the center of decision making for Chicago Public Schools, but also the city at large. So finally, also as the year comes to a close, we want to wish you and your families a safe, restful, and joyful holiday season. And thank you again for being a part of tonight's conversation. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. Happy holidays. Take care.